They laughed at him. They dismissed his strange drawings as the fantasies of a lonely man. They stacked his papers in dusty archives, shelved away like forgotten dreams. But now, year after year, what once looked like madness has begun to resemble memory, not our memory, but someone else's, someone who came before us, looking ahead, seeing what humanity refused to believe. And among all his visions, all his cryptic lines, all his trembling sketches, one stands darker than the rest. A drawing so simple, so quiet, so mercilessly direct, that even researchers struggle to look at it for long. At the top, a date. 2026. Beneath it, a human figure that no longer looks fully human. Flames rise behind it. Shadows swallow the city around it. And beneath the crumbling towers, just for words that feel like a sentence, man will not be man. This is where our story begins. Not with a prophecy wrapped in poetry, not with vague symbols open to 1,000 interpretations, but with a message so sharp it cuts through time. Something is coming, the drawing says. Something deep, something structural, something that will touch not just nations or systems or governments, but the very definition of humanity itself. You can almost imagine Parravicini, sitting alone at his desk, pencil trembling in his hand, as that mysterious force he described, a voice dictated by light guided his strokes. A man who never asked to see the future, yet could not look away. The figure in the drawing appears trapped between worlds. It stands upright like a human, yet the posture feels hollow, the outline thin, as if something important has slipped out of it. The flames behind it are not the flames of calamity, they are the flames of transformation, and the shadows that stretch across the sketch feel almost alive, curling around the collapsing buildings as though consuming the last remnants of a world that once believed itself unbreakable. This is not a prophecy of fire. It is a prophecy of identity, a warning that the greatest danger to mankind may not be a weapon or a war, but a shift within the human soul itself. For decades, people ignored it. Who could take seriously a drawing made in the early 20th century predicting the collapse of cities, the fall of nations, the hollowing out of humanity? Who could believe that a painter from Argentina, quiet, unassuming, often alone, could see further into the 21st century than entire governments with their satellites and intelligence networks? But slowly, quietly, the world began to shift toward the shape he drew. We entered an age where people feel less connected than ever, even as screens tie us together. We entered a time where machines speak, think, and increasingly decide. We began losing something not all at once, not suddenly, but piece by piece, until some could no longer describe what being human truly meant. If you look closely at the drawing, you see another detail. The figure's head is tilted upward, not in hope, not in pride, but in something like confusion, as if searching for a light it once knew but no longer remembers. A soul trying to find its way back through the darkness? This is why researchers say the 2026 sketch is different from his other works. It is not just a prediction of disaster. It is a portrait of a choice. A mirror held up to humanity long before humanity stepped into the room. When Parravicini first created it, he didn't explain what he saw. He rarely did. He simply wrote the words that came to him. The words he claimed were placed in his mind without warning. And when he wrote, "Man will not be man," he left no footnotes, no clarifications, no gentle elaboration to soften the blow. He delivered the message as is, raw and unfiltered, not to terrify, not to impress, but because that was what he received. A warning not of extinction, but of transformation. A dark transformation so complete that the boundary between human and something else would blur. Even now, the meaning of the phrase stirs unease. Some interpret it as technological domination, a world where human thoughts are overshadowed by artificial minds. Others see it as the decay of spirit, a collapse of morality, faith, and meaning that empties humanity from within. And others still believe it points to a global deception, a pressure that reshapes mankind, not physically, but spiritually, bending identity until it breaks. But all interpretations share one thread. Something essential will be at stake. And perhaps that is why the date matters. 2026, not a far-off prophecy for generations unborn. Not an encrypted clue buried in metaphor. A near date. A reachable moment. A crossroads standing just ahead of us, close enough to feel its shadow stretching across the present. For many who study his work, the fear is not rooted in the drawing's darkness. It is rooted in its accuracy. How many of Parravicini's earlier sketches have already unfolded before our eyes? The fall of towers, the rise of pandemics, the merging of man and machine, the moral confusion of an age that forgets its own foundations. So when he marked a specific year, 2026, people began to ask, what did he see? What change was so profound, so irreversible, that he believed humanity would step through one door and never come out the same? Why did he choose that date? Or rather, why was that date chosen for him? There is a detail few mention. At the bottom of the drawing, barely visible, is a faint line, almost like an unfinished sketch of a road or a path leading into darkness. Some researchers say it symbolizes the narrowing of choices. Others believe it marks the final corridor before the transformation takes hold. A few more mystical voices argue it represents the tunnel between two ages. the age of illusion and the age of revelation. Look again at the burning city behind the figure, not a city consumed by war, but one collapsing from within. Buildings break not as if bombed, but as though hollow, brittle, unsupported. A world that falls not because others attacked it, but because it could no longer hold itself up. And then there is the light, thin, faint, almost invisible, falling from above onto the figure's face. Even in the darkest prophecy, Parravicini left a trace of hope. A chance? A direction? A reminder that even if 2026 brings the shaking of all foundations, the soul that looks upward will still find something left to hold. Perhaps that is the real message hidden in the drawing. Not doom, but decision. Not punishment, but awakening. A call written in fire, shadow, and silence. Before the world spoke his name with fear, Benjamin Solari Parravicini lived like a man no one would ever notice. A small apartment in Buenos Aires, a quiet workshop that smelled of old paint and turpentine. A life that, at first glance, seemed destined to pass without leaving a mark. He was born in 1898, into a world still lit by candles and horse-drawn carriages, far from the skyscrapers, satellites, and silent machines he would later sketch with uncanny precision. Those who knew him described him as gentle, shy, almost fragilous if he lived half present in this world and half in a place the rest of humanity could not reach. He worked as a painter, but not the kind whose canvases hung in prestigious halls. His art was simple, honest, at times painfully ordinary. Flowers, people, moments of daily life. There was nothing in those early works to suggest he would become one of the most unsettling prophetic voices of the 20th century, and perhaps that is why his story feels so different from others who claimed visions. He never asked for attention. He never demanded belief. He never proclaimed himself chosen. Instead, he whispered through drawings the world wasn't ready to see. The turning point came quietly. No lightning, no visions in the sky, no trembling earth. Parravicini would simply sit at his desk at night, and something shifted. He described it later as a presence that stood behind him, peaceful, firm, impossible to ignore. A voice of light that entered not through his ears, but through some inner doorway he didn't know existed. And then his hand would move, not trembling, not hesitant, but with purpose, as if guided by a will beyond his own. These were not paintings. They were psychographies, drawings that appeared as fast as thought, each accompanied by a phrase short, sharp, cryptic, phrases that made no sense to his friends, no sense to himself, and certainly no sense to the world of the 1930s and 40s. He drew towers falling long before skyscrapers ever defined the American skyline. He sketched strange devices, screens, circuits, machines that seemed to think. He wrote of pandemics, political fractures, moral collapse, and a humanity drifting into confusion. People thought he was losing his mind. His friends worried. His family prayed. Doctors examined him, suspecting hallucinations or nervous exhaustion, but nothing explained the clarity with which he spoke of the visions, nor the consistency of the light he said guided him. And so, like most uncomfortable mysteries, society placed him in the safe box labeled harmless, eccentric, a man whose imagination outran his time. He never argued with them, he never defended himself. He simply continued drawing. For decades, these psychographies accumulated hundreds upon hundreds stacked in drawers, forgotten in folders, gathering dust in corners of the very house where he once lived. Occasionally someone would open a sketchbook and glance inside, but the images felt too strange, too unsettling, too disconnected from reality. Airplanes crashing into towers, cities falling from within, machines ruling over men. They set the drawings aside with a laugh or a shrug. The world had its own worries and was not interested in the nightmares of an obscure Argentine painter. But then came the morning of September 11, 2001. The world watched in horror as flames swallowed steel, and the sky over New York turned black. And suddenly, almost impossibly, someone remembered an old sketch. A strange drawing made in the 1930s. 2 tall buildings, a plane, and the handwritten phrase, "The freedom of North America will lose its light. The monument will be attacked twice." In that moment, the world stopped laughing. Historians scrambled through archives. Believers whispered that a forgotten message had tried to warn humanity 70 years before. Skeptics grew quiet, sensing that coincidence had stretched farther than coincidence should. And across countless homes, people stared at the drawing and felt the same cold shiver. How did he know? But it didn't stop there. His sketches contained references to the rise of global surveillance systems long before the first satellite was launched. He drew images eerily similar to modern smartphones. He described plagues spreading through the air and causing worldwide panic. He warned of nations collapsing from within, leaders who speak peace but bring confusion, and societies that would forget the truth and wear the mask of lies. He drew men fused with machines. He wrote, "The man will be machine," and he described a time when humanity, surrounded by glowing screens, would lose its spiritual center. Piece by piece, prophecy began to look less like symbolism and more like a slow unfolding script. Yet through all of this, Parravicini himself remained an enigma. He did not charge money for his drawings. He refused any attempt to commercialize them. He rarely spoke publicly about their source, and when pressed, he answered with the same gentle humility, "I do not know who dictates them. I only obey." In an era filled with self-proclaimed prophets, hungry for power, fame, or devotion, his quiet sincerity stood apart. He had nothing to gain, everything to lose, and yet, he kept drawing. Those who witnessed his episodes described something remarkable. He would fall silent, eyes distant, as if his mind stepped beyond the room. Then his hand would move quickly, confidently. Sometimes he wrote words he later admitted he didn't fully understand. Sometimes he drew symbols that only decades later revealed their meaning. Always the same state, peaceful, yet deeply solemn. As though he knew every stroke carried a weight he could not explain. There were darker moments too. Times when the message overwhelmed him. Times when the images he saw collapsing civilizations, burning cities, empty souls left him shaken. He once told a close friend, "What is coming is not for me to understand, but for others to remember." It was perhaps the closest he ever came to admitting fear. After his death in 1974, his notebooks drifted into obscurity again. Without the man, the message seemed easier to cancel, easier to doubt, easier to bury. The world returned to its routines, unaware that a drawing labeled 2026 waited quietly in the stack watching time march toward it, year by year. And perhaps that is the strangest part of all. Parravicini never asked to be believed. He never demanded that his visions be studied, protected, or even respected. But time itself, slow, relentless, undeniable, did what he could not. It breathed life into his lines, and it turned a forgotten painter into a reluctant messenger. A man who drew tomorrow's disasters long before tomorrow knew its own name. There is a moment in every prophecy when symbolism stops being symbolic and begins to feel like a diagnosis. A moment when the metaphor becomes a mirror. For Parravicini, that moment crystallized in a single sketch, a drawing so stark it felt almost unfinished, as if the urgency of the message mattered more than the aesthetic of the lines. At its center stands a lone human form. No face, no detail, no expression. Just the silhouette of someone who looks human, but no longer is in the way humanity understands itself. And above that figure, written with a tension that almost cuts the page, are the words, 2026, the year of the great change. Man will not be man. This was not a prediction wrapped in poetry. It was not a riddle. It was a verdict. A line drawn across time. A transformation announced long before anyone knew what technology could do, what politics could break, or what the human soul could forget. To understand the force of this prophecy, you must look closely at the figure. It stands upright, yet its posture carries no strength. The shoulders droop. The arms hang as if weightless. It resembles a person who has lost something invisible but essential: spirit, will, purpose. Behind the figure, the city collapses in silence. The buildings lean as though hollowed out. Foundations eroded not by bombs or storms but by abandonment, rot, inner decay. Flames lick the edges of the skyline, not as an explosion, but as a quiet consuming an erosion of what once stood tall. It is the expression of a world that did not fall, but gave way. Many scholars who study Parravicini's drawings describe this sketch as the moment where his visions stop warning about events outside humanity and begin warning about the transformation within. And perhaps that is why the phrase "man will not be man" feels so heavy. It does not say humanity will end. It says humanity will change. Not through destruction, but through substitution, through forgetfulness. Through trade what is human traded for something easier, colder, faster. The world today almost seems designed to fit inside the lines of this drawing. Machines speak. Algorithms decide. Screens glow brighter than the sun in the eyes of those who stare into them. Humanity's memory weakens as information becomes outsourced. Thoughts become automated. Choices become guided by unseen systems. Parravicini warned of the man becoming machine at a time when machines barely existed. Yet here we stand at the threshold of an age where intelligence is no longer purely human, where identity itself can be edited, curated, reshaped by digital hands. But the prophecy does not rest solely on technology. Look again at the empty face of the figure. It is not the face of someone overtaken by circuits. It is the face of someone who has lost themselves. This, many believe, is the deeper layer of the message. Not technological possession, but spiritual erosion. A humanity that forgets its own soul. A humanity that trades faith for convenience, truth for distraction, purpose for pleasure, connection for simulation. And when the human soul empties, what remains may still look like a person, but the essence is gone. A shell. A silhouette. That emptiness is echoed in the ruins behind the figure. A city collapsing not from war but from exhaustion. Values fading, moral compasses spinning. People more connected, yet more lonely, more informed, yet more confused. The destruction in the drawing is not fire falling from the sky, it is the slow decay of meaning, the quiet collapse of a society that forgot what anchors it. And that, some scholars say, is why Parravicini marked the year 2026, not to announce a single catastrophic event, but the culmination of many small transformations that have been gathering like storm clouds for decades. A convergence, a threshold, a point beyond which humanity becomes something else, either less than human or, for a few, more fully alive than ever. There is another detail in the drawing, the shadows. They creep up behind the figure, stretching long and distorted. If fire represents destruction, shadows represent influence forces unseen, subtle, shaping the human mind slowly. Parravicini wrote often about the darkening of man's inner light, a period when humanity's spiritual awareness dims even as intellectual power grows, a time when people mistake information for wisdom, noise for truth, desire for identity. These shadows may be the forces shaping humanity from within, bending thought and heart until the soul becomes secondary. Nothing terrifies researchers more than how precisely this aligns with today's crisis of meaning. Depression at record highs, anxiety saturating every layer of society, loneliness sweeping across nations like an invisible plague. People adrift in a world where everything is available except purpose. Parravicini seemed to suggest that the great danger of the future was not violence but emptiness. And emptiness, when embraced long enough, becomes transformation. Still, even in a prophecy so bleak, there is a strange tenderness hidden in the image. The figure is looking upward, not down at the ruins, not back at the shadows. Upward toward, a faint light breaking through the smoke, a reminder that the drawing is not a prison, but a choice. That even in the year of great change, the human soul retains a spark that darkness cannot claim, unless it is surrendered willingly. And this, perhaps, is what makes the prophecy so unsettling. It is not inevitable, it is invitational. It asks a question rather than issuing a command. What will humanity become when the moment arrives? Will it let go of its spirit? Will it cling to what remains? Will it look upward or inward or not at all? For Parravicini, 2026 was not just a date. It was a crossroads, a dividing line, a point where humanity steps into a new identity, either reclaimed or lost. The drawing does not show an ending. It shows a transformation waiting for permission. And now, as we approach the threshold he marked decades ago, the question written between the lines becomes impossible to ignore. If man will not be man in 2026, then what will we be? There is a particular kind of silence that follows a prophecy, one that is not born of ignorance, but of fear. The kind of silence powerful institutions cultivate when a message threatens the very structure they depend on. Parravicini never shouted his visions, he whispered them. He hid nothing, and yet somehow, the world managed not to hear him, not because the message was too faint, but because someone kept turning down the volume. For decades, his drawings remained locked away in private collections, uncatalogued in libraries, ignored by academics, dismissed by institutions that should have preserved them, not lost bare. And among those hundreds of sketches, one in particular spent years overlooked, forgotten between pages, as if the world was not meant to see it until the very last possible moment. It is the smallest of all his drawings. No burning city, no collapsing towers, no shadowy figure staring upward. Just a closed book, a single falling tear, and 3 words written beneath. The third message arrives. No date, no context, no explanation. Nothing but a warning so quiet that humanity nearly stepped over it without ever seeing it. For a long time, people assumed this drawing meant nothing. A simple sketch, a moment of sentimentality, a stray thought he put to paper in his later years. But once researchers started revisiting his psychographies through the lens of everything that had already come true, the tear beside the closed book took on a different weight, like a sorrow too deep to speak aloud. The book, many now believe, represents truth that has been available all along but left unread. The tear is not his, but ours. The grief of a world that once knew the light and chose instead the glow of artificial stars. If his first message was ignored, if his second message was mocked, then the third, he suggested, would not be delivered in words. It would arrive through events. And that is where 2026 enters, not as a prophecy written in ink, but as a pressure building in the corridors of history. A year that seems to whisper from the threshold, prepare. The narrowing door of choice, of faith, of moral clarity. A moment when truth will not knock gently. It will break through by force. But why would such a message be buried? Why would the institutions that guard knowledge choose silence when the world needed warning? The answer is found not in conspiracy, but in fear. Throughout history, governments and global powers have feared the same thing. A population that questions, awakens, refuses to obey blindly. Parravicini's prophecies were not threats to society, they were threats to the systems that govern society. Because if people realized the depth of the spiritual struggle beneath political and technological shifts, they would stop being controllable. A person who sees the truth is dangerous to those who profit from illusions. That is why his work was ignored. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was uncomfortable. He wrote of leaders who speak peace but bring confusion. He sketched faceless authorities monitoring crowds through screens long before surveillance became reality. He warned that institutions would distort truth not just by lying, but by drowning truth beneath noise. If that is not our world today, then no prophecy has ever meant anything. Even the academic world hesitated to examine him. His drawings did not fit into neat categories. They challenged the rational frameworks scholars cling to. And so, year after year, Parravicini's work was treated like a stain on the clean surface of modern intellect, pushed aside rather than confronted. But silence cannot last forever. As the world began moving toward the very conditions he described, mass confusion, spiritual dryness, identity collapse, technological dominance, the pressure built. Like a sealed room filling with smoke, like a narrowing door through which fewer and fewer people would pass. And that narrowing is the heart of the third message. It is not a catastrophe, it is not an omen of destruction. It is the moment where humanity must decide whether to wake up or slip further into the sleep of false comfort. A decision that no government, no religion, no movement can make on behalf of a single soul. Each person must choose for themselves. That is why the closed book matters. Parravicini believed that truth was already given, long before his visions. The divine message was never hidden, it was simply ignored. The third message, therefore, is not new information, but the last invitation to finally open the book we were always meant to read. For some, this message arrives quietly, like a whisper in the night. For others, it arrives violently through crises that shatter illusions. And for the world as a whole, it may come in the form of a collective shaking. A year that compresses decades of spiritual drift into a single, unavoidable moment. 2026, he implied, is that moment. Not the end, not the apocalypse, but the point at which the door begins to close. This is why so many feel the urgency tightening around the world today. Politics cracking, societies fragmenting, people losing their grip on truth, drowning in noise, exhaustion, and a hunger that nothing material can satisfy. The tension between light and shadow has become visible not in the heavens, but in the human heart, and in this tension lies the reason for censorship. A world built on distraction cannot tolerate reminders of truth. A system that thrives on spiritual emptiness cannot allow a prophecy that calls people back to the core of their being. So the message is buried, the warning is ignored, the book remains closed. Not because it is irrelevant, but because it is dangerous. Yet the third message arrives anyway. Not through institutions, not through leaders, but through events that shake the soul awake. Through moments of elapse that force people to choose, remain a silhouette, hollowed out by confusion, or step into the light that Parravicini insisted would never disappear, no matter how narrow the path becomes. Some say the narrowing door is simply faith returning to the world. Others say it is judgment. Others believe it is the separation of those who will be consumed by the great change and those who will walk through it illuminated. Parravicini never clarified which. He only drew the tear and the book, and the message that now feels like the softest, sharpest whisper across the threshold of 2026. The third message arrives. There is a pattern in Parravicini's work, subtle yet relentless, like a quiet drum beat beneath the chaos he drew. After every collapse, every burning skyline, every trembling silhouette of humanity losing its way, he sketched something else, something almost impossible to notice at first glance. A light, a sprout, a lone figure kneeling but unbroken. It is as if, in the aftermath of every prophecy of darkness, he carved out a small opening no wider than a whisper, yet strong enough to hold an entire future. And perhaps the most powerful example of this is a drawing the world rarely talks about, a handful of people, kneeling in prayer, surrounded by fire, but untouched by it. Beneath that scene, he wrote, "The humble and faithful will walk through the fire and not be burned." It is here, in this contrast, a collapsing world set beside a kneeling remnant, that the meaning of 2026 becomes clearer. Parravicini never said the entire world would fall. He never claimed that humanity would vanish. He never declared that the flames were final. Instead, he showed that the fire was a test, a refining, a line drawn through the center of the human soul. A moment where the illusion of strength crumbles, but real strength finally reveals itself. The broken clock frozen at midnight echoes this same idea. Time stopping not as destruction, but as an interruption. A divine pause. A moment when false time constructed comforts, artificial meaning, mechanical identity shatters, making space for something truer, older, and more luminous. For Parravicini, the end of illusion was not a tragedy. It was the beginning of clarity. So what, then, is the remnant? Who are those who walk through the fire unburned? They are not the strongest, not the wealthiest, not the most informed. They are the ones still holding a fragile but unbroken thread of faith in a world that keeps trying to cut it. They are the ones who refuse to bow to confusion, even when everyone around them does. They are the ones who still look upward when the sky turns black. These people do not escape the fire. They enter it, and they emerge transformed, not consumed. For Parravicini, the remnant was always the heart of the prophecy. The survivors not of destruction, but of deception. The ones who recognize that the great danger of 2026 is not the collapse of structures, but the collapse of identity. Not flames outside, but the fire within, the refining fire that reveals who we truly are. And so, when he sketched crosses shining above burning cities, he was not predicting the triumph of religion as institution. He was pointing toward the endurance of faith as relationship. Truth, he wrote, will be hidden but not lost. That is the promise woven through his darkest visions. That even in the year of great change, even when man will not be man, the spark of what makes us human, the divine echo, the breath of God cannot be erased unless we surrender it willingly. In another drawing, a kneeling man clutches a Bible while a beam of light breaks the sky open above him. Beneath it, Parravicini wrote, "The new man will rise from faith. It is the only time in his hundreds of psychographies that he used the phrase new man. This was not the hollow figure of 2026, stripped of soul. This was the restored version, the awakened version, the version refined by fire rather than emptied by shadow. In that drawing, the silhouette is not broken, it is illuminated. Here lies the paradox of the prophecy. 2026 may break the world, but it might also begin something breathtakingly new, and it will not emerge from governments, from technologies, or from collapsing empires. It will rise from individuals quiet, small, unnoticed by the world who decide not to let go of their inner light, from the remnant who choose clarity over confusion, truth over comfort, faith over fear. The narrowing door Parravicini warned about is not the closing of opportunity, it is the clarifying of it, a moment when distractions fall away, illusions burn off, and the only thing left is the simple, ancient question, what do you carry inside? Because when everything around us collapses, only what is internal survives. Some will step through the fire and find themselves unmade by it. Others will step through and find themselves reborn. And this quiet, radiant choice is why Parravicini never drew the world ending. He drew the world awakening. He drew time breaking so the spirit could rise. He drew the shadow giving way to the faint but undeniable glow of something eternal. 2026 is not the conclusion. It is the crossing. And on the other side, a new humanity waits, one, shaped not by machines or politics, but by faith strong enough to walk through flames without fear. So now, as we stand only steps away from the year he marked, the world feels like a puzzle rearranging itself into the shape he sketched long ago. Shadows lengthen. Noise rises. Institutions tremble. People lose their footing in the shifting ground beneath them. And yet, in the middle of that trembling, something gentle persists, a quiet inner call, a soft recognition that the fire he saw was not sent to destroy, but to reveal. We do not walk into 2026 alone. Each of us carries something: faith, doubt, fear, longing. Each of us carries questions we've been afraid to articulate, questions about purpose, direction, identity. And while the world chants louder, trying to drown out the whisper, that whisper remains. It waits, it persists, it invites. The remnant is not a chosen group. It is anyone who hears that whisper, even faintly. Anyone who looks upward, even once. Anyone who senses that beneath the noise, a deeper truth is moving. So take this moment before the year turns, before the shaking intensifies, to breathe, to steady your heart, to remember that fire does not merely consume. It also purifies. It clears the ground. It makes room for new life to break through the ashes. Perhaps that is what Parravicini wanted most to say, that when darkness gathers, light becomes easier to see. When time breaks, the soul begins to rise. And when everything the world built falls away, what remains is what was always meant to endure. Walk gently, walk awake. And when the fire comes, may you walk through it unburned.